Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. My colleagues in Budapest and in Rome are also listening online to this presentation today. And I'm here to talk to you about due diligence and risks in the agricultural sector, particularly with a focus looking at international standards, particularly European standards, directives, regulations that will impact Croatian agri-food companies from the end of this year. So a lot of people come to me first when they ask, why are you interested in business? You work for an international organization. What's the relationship between what you do and what a company like Podravka does, for instance? Well, there is a big relationship, and the relationship is that when we have demand for food, we know that in Croatia we consume a lot of local products. We like paški sir, we like a lot of Croatian delicacies, but we also know that I would argue a majority of our products do not come from Croatia. And as a result of this demand, there are risks that take place on the other side of the chain. Right? When you look at our chocolate that comes from Kraš or Bajadere, which we all really much like to eat, none of those products are domestic products, right? The chocolate comes from Ecuador or it comes from Ghana. The sugar maybe comes from Dominican Republic or Guatemala, and so on and so forth. So as a result of these dynamics, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations really looks at how we can increasingly feed a growing population with a specific focus on the market demands for drivers of particular commodities in this context, right? So particularly working with companies, governments such as the Republic of Croatia, which would be great to work with more closely in the future on these issues, looking at how companies can make a positive contribution to economic, environmental, and social progress with a view to achieving sustainable development, right? So really moving beyond the traditional language of sustainability to consider sustainability in the entire supply chain, which is also part of regulation today. And also looking at how the impact of one particular company who's based in Zagreb or in Split can impact individuals all the way around the world in a different geography. So this comes from my own research in my spare time. I'm doing a PhD on this very topic. And when we look from 2010 up until 2023-24, we see a very large incremental increase of regulation related to responsible areas that are linked to responsible business conduct, right? In 2010, we saw an incremental increase in regulations, particularly in the United States, looking at transparency in the supply chain, right? How companies are increasingly being asked to demonstrate that they're not linked to issues such as bribery, corruption, etc. However, as time progressed, arguably from 2011, 2012 onwards, with an increase particularly in 2019, we see a larger concentration of legislation that's focused specifically on supply chain issues. And this is where our colleagues who work in the NCP office are very much linked to and lead a lot of these operations related to our guidance documents, which I'll speak to in a second. So these areas can be categorized in 4 areas. One, which is what I spoke to earlier, corporate governance, transparency, bribery, legislation, secondly, that speak to environmental and social due diligence, so risks in the supply chain, which we'll be talking about here. Sustainability reporting, which many of you are familiar with already. Our colleagues Miri and I and many others have been working on these excellent topics for years now, and helping companies to report on their sustainability efforts. And lastly, key development concerns, so thematic concerns in the supply chains, such as deforestation, climate change, greenwashing, forced labor, child labor, decent work, and others. So I work a lot with companies and governments and stakeholders, particularly outside of the European Union as well, in Argentina, Chile, Botswana, and many others. And a lot of them look at some of these issues and they say, these are trade barriers for us. We're not able, we don't have sustainability teams of 20 people that we can, address these issues. And the high-income markets, such as the European Union or the United States, are asking us to do things that we can't do. And you know, in a way, I understand them. Of course, oftentimes, you know, a lot of the food that we consume here in Croatia comes from areas where they don't have electricity for many hours in one day, right? Or they don't have stable internet access, etc. So it's very difficult to think about how they can integrate sustainability from their perspective, right? Even in Croatia, in some areas, rural areas, you know, they struggle with not having the same conditions as we would in Rijeka or in Zagreb or in others, right? Now, the way that I rationalize this as well, and of course I have to give credit to my co-author on this as well, is looking at the rise of sustainability standards over the years, particularly in the agri-food sector. In the 1960s, we had the development of the Codex Alimentarius, right, which was a product of both the FAO and the WHO, setting the international stage for what is considered acceptable for food production and exports, so that we have a baseline for the entire world of what constitutes responsibility and what constitutes safety for the travel, the production, the travel, and the consumption of products, food products. Now, as time grows, as time grew forward, we had more specific interests from markets, right, looking for certain aspects of sustainable products, particularly organic standards, right? In many markets, people wanted food that are not, you know, that are free of GMOs, that don't have, that are not linked to any dangerous chemicals, that are, you know, healthier for them as well, and that was accompanied with a larger, you know, health food type of movement as well. From that, you know, we also see the growth of fair trade standards. So increasingly, particularly in the 1980s and early 1990s, we saw a very large increase of standards from individuals or from groups that wanted to see more labeling and more production practices that adhere to responsible business, really the earlier movements of the responsible business. So fair wages, fair labor, etc. Now, continuing on, we saw, particularly in the late 1990s, retail standards grow, right, such as Global GAP, which is good agricultural practices, standards that try to set kind of common areas for what companies should be doing in terms of sustainability at the larger scale. And lastly, the last two areas are where we're kind of coming now in this legislative movement on responsible supply chains, which is multi-stakeholder initiatives, which were created to really try to reduce risk, most of them in supply chains, right? So looking at the responsible soy roundtable, or the responsible palm oil roundtables as well, responsible beef. And all of these type of standards are a conglomeration of different actors. So NGOs, governments, companies, etc., who agree on certain standards for that commodity product to be released into the market. Now, the last movement, which is where we're sitting here today and what we're going to be discussing in this event, is the growth of standards that relate to responsible sourcing and management. So it goes much beyond outsourcing risk to third-party providers, so to management consultants or to you know, some kind of audit systems, but really asking companies to identify and mitigate risk based on where they sit themselves in cooperation with their business partners, all the way up to the supply chain in Botswana or Argentina or wherever those products come from. So what I thought would be very useful for a Croatian audience, and again, I'm so happy to speak to Croatians, I never really have the opportunity in my job to do that, is kind of identifying some of the main legislative areas that will impact Croatian companies soon. Many of you already know this, but I'm sure there's some in the room that are not familiar with these legislations. So one is the regulation on deforestation-free supply chains, the EUDR, which it was already approved and which will become applicable as of the 30th of December around the years. And what it does is it requires companies to introduce deforestation-focused due diligence on goods imported into the EU or exported outside of the EU.